It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Andrew Rosindell, Labour MP Carolyn Harris, Guardian Deputy Political Editor Jessica Elgot and Sunday Times columnist Matthew Syed. Today, will this lead to a summer of self-isolation?
Anyone who's a close contact of a positive case will no longer have to self-isolate if they have been fully vaccinated.
Expect the Prime Minister to face questions about ending restrictions in England. That's PMQ's live at noon.
When I was growing up, my parents always had 2 or 3 jobs and I never saw them and, all of that. In general, Icelanders have worked too much, but now we are kind of realising that that's not sustainable.
Should the UK follow Iceland and try a 4-day week? Is there anything wrong with adding the Union flag to this building in Cardiff? And
it's a bit like being a parent. You've gone past the moment where it's about you and it's about what you pass on to others.
What can politicians learn from Gareth Southgate? Well, there is only one game in town, of course. That's the semi-final, England against Denmark. Let's have a look at what the Prime Minister and Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, have been saying ahead of that big match. Here's the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. Gareth Southgate and the England squad have done the nation proud in the Euros, and tonight we will all be wishing them the best of luck in getting to the final. Bring it home. And Sir Keir Starmer says Gareth Southgate and the squad will have the whole nation behind them tonight, both on and off the pitch. They have shown the best of England. There's been only one song featured in our house since Saturday. It's Coming Home. I can just hear them singing it now. Let's also show you this piece by our guest, Matthew Syed, BBC Online, Euros 2020, what all of us can learn from Gareth Southgate. Tell us a little bit more about it, Matthew.
Well, thank you. I think English football traditionally has been quite insular. It's been run by footballing men and footballing head coaches surrounded by other footballing men. And the idea of bringing in fresh voices and new ideas has been anathema. When Gareth Southgate was appointed in 2016, he had a different approach. One bit of that is the Technical Advisory Board, which is chaired by David Sheepshanks, and it has a cycling coach on it, Dave Brailsford, Manoj Badal, who's a high-tech person, Stuart Lancaster, a rugby coach, Lucy Giles from the Sandhurst Military Training Academy, Kath Granger, a rower. I happen to sit on it too. I'm a former ping-pong international, and it's kind of brought a diversity of ideas on diet and preparation and data analysis. And I think it's indicative of a coach who's always reaching out for more rather than getting stuck in what has conventionally been a bit of an echo chamber. Right,
well, Andrew and Carolyn, what can politicians learn from that style of leadership? Andrew?
I think we just want England to win tonight, frankly. That's all I'm concerned about. Gareth Southgate has done a fantastic job, and we all wish him well in the squad. I remember that match when he failed to get that goal in. I think it was 1996.
Penalty, yeah.
Yeah. So, tonight we need victory. We want England to win, and I hope the whole country are going to unite behind the squad. And I'm certainly going to be very excited to see a victory for England in football. It's so rare it happens, so I'm fingers crossed it's going to happen tonight.
What about the boost, Carolyn, that could come to an England team that hasn't always succeeded in the past?
Well, I think it's fantastic that England are where they are. Can I just give a shout-out to the Scottish and the Welsh teams, who also did really well, but I should hope that the whole country is behind the England team tonight. We're big Chelsea fans in my house, so I'm shouting for Mason Monk and Ben Chilwell and for Reece James, and I just know that the whole country will be very proud if England win tonight.
But listening to what Matthew has said and outlining in his piece, it's about a recipe for success. Echo chambers don't work. You want a diversity of thought. Do you agree with that?
I totally do, and I think I've done that in my own politics. I've never achieved anything in politics unless it's been cross-party. The Children's Funeral Fund, the Reform on Gambling, and now the menopause campaign I'm running. It's all done cross-party. If we don't work together, we never achieve anything. I think it's brilliant what Gareth Southgate have done.
Jess, do you agree with that? Don't surround yourself, if you're in a leadership position, with people who think the same.
I think it's absolutely right. I thought Matthew's piece was fantastic, and it recalls to me my own team, Leeds United. There was a lot of doubts about our manager, Marcelo Bielsa, when he first came in, saying he couldn't do it on a cold night in Rotherham. He's this kind of maverick figure, and he's just been the most fantastic, revolutionary figure for the club, and outside politics as well. I think bringing in people who can challenge you is very important. One of the things people say about Boris Johnson at the moment is he doesn't have a lot of closely trusted advisors who can challenge him, who can hold him back. And, you know, I think that sort of thing is important in all walks of life.
Right. I mean, Matthew, again, listening to what you've heard, everyone agreeing with the thrust of your piece. Do you think it actually happens in reality in politics?
Well, in politics, one of the key aspects of diversity is diversity in social class. Policies often affect very different groups of people. And if you have a group of decision makers, even if they look different ethnically, if they come from the same social class, and don't have a good understanding of how those policies will land amongst people who live in tall tower blocks and other things of that kind. A very good book by Ivor Crewe and Anthony King regard the lack of diversity in social class as one of the Achilles heels of British government in the post-war age. And I think one has to be sensible about how one strategically optimises what I call cognitive diversity. I think we could do it better in British politics.
All right. Well, we're going to talk about COVID, unsurprisingly, and the ending of restrictions. Let's just play you a little bit of Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, who was at a conference yesterday.
It's going to take quite a long time, I think, to get back to a normality. And I certainly would be surprised if we got back to what I would most of us would see as a kind of status quo from before the pandemic, before the next spring, because I think we've got this current wave. Hopefully there'll be a period of quieter COVID after that. And then the likelihood is there will be quite a difficult winter, especially for the NHS. And then by next spring, I'm hoping slightly more into a more predictable pattern.
Right, not normal before spring. Andrew, were you surprised by his assessment?
No, he's always, in my view, been a little bit cautious and pessimistic. That's his job. My job and the job of the government is to get the country moving again and to rebuild confidence so that people can start to rebuild things, because the effects of the pandemic and the lockdowns and restrictions, I think, are going to be with us for a very long time to come. It's not just COVID, it's the effects of lockdown, because I think that we haven't yet really assessed how bad that's going to be in the years ahead.
Carolyn?
Well, I think Chris Whitty is the expert on this. His interest is to make sure the people of the country are safe. The government's interest is to make sure that the economy thrives, and they're both really important. But I do worry that we're having announcements about opening and all restrictions on self-isolating being lifted when Chris Whitty is saying something completely different. And my big question would be, what's going to happen to those who have to self-isolate in between the July the 16th and August the 16th? Because, I mean, what financial support is the government going to give them? Where's the detail on the big plan? Because we've not seen that yet, and there are big questions to be answered. Right,
so you would want to follow Chris Whitty more closely?
I think that we need to, I agree we need to open up the country, but I think we need to do it cautiously.
All right. Matthew, he seemed gloomier in a way, Chris Whitty, than he was when he appeared with Boris Johnson last week. Why do you think that might be?
Well, I think he knows, as I think most other scientists and the rest of the population know, that opening up to the extent that we plan to do is a serious risk. And I worry that we should have a more cautious reopening. What we really want to do is have those restrictions that have the least economic impact and the least impact on our young people and mental health, whilst at the same time trying to make sure that we bear down upon what is still a very nasty disease. And I think we should keep a very close eye on the data as we move forward. The vaccinations have clearly weakened the link between infection, hospitalizations and death, but it hasn't severed them completely. So I think we still have to be quite cautious.
Right. I mean, is there a gap opening up, do you think, Jess, a bigger gap perhaps between the scientists and the politicians?
I think if you talk to a lot of scientists, as we have been doing over the past few days, it's not all one way. There is certainly an acceptance of some of the things that Chris Whitty actually said at the press conference on Monday, that if you don't open up now in the summer months with this natural fire break of the summer holidays, then when do you? But clearly the figures are very worrying, and there is starting to be a little bit of talk about, is there anything the government could do to row back slightly on the reopening that they announced yesterday? We reported yesterday 2 million people could contract COVID this summer. What that potentially means that up to 10 million can isolate over the next 6 weeks. Will that mean that people are simply going to ditch the NHS app, and what is the consequences for that? And we also understand that ministers were warned that if they waive the requirement for contacts to isolate on the 19th of July, i.e. along with everything else, that would result in cases being 25% higher rather than waiting another 4 weeks. So the figures do not look good, but again, the same argument is that waiting to lift them in the winter might make things even worse. And
we'll look at that in a bit more detail. But Andrew, briefly responding to what Jess said, will there be any rowing back, do you think, by the politicians?
Well, I hope not. I think the country wants to move on now. Look, you can constantly think of reasons to carry on with restrictions and lockdowns. We're never going to get out of this if we don't actually take a bold approach. And I think that's what the Prime Minister's now doing. With countries got to move forward. And yes, we will have to learn to live with this virus to a limited extent, but we do with other viruses and other potential risks in our lives. We can't mitigate against every risk forevermore. We have to make a decision to take things forward as a country, and that's what the Prime Minister's done, and I support him in doing so.
I mean, briefly before we move on, Matthew, you have warned before about the tyranny of scientists, is how I think you put it in that sense. So do you welcome that there is a gap opening up?
Well, what I have a problem with is, for example, a card-carrying communist like Susan Michie making arguments and potentially smuggling in political prejudice under the guise of scientific objectivity. It is absolutely critical that our democratic institutions are capable of testing scientific advice, making sure that it is on the objective terrain of empiricism rather than potential value judgments being smuggled in. And this is a multidimensional problem. It isn't just a medical issue. It's an issue with an impact on our society, on our economy. But I just push back a little that Boris Johnson's moving forward. Well, that's true if you associate the removing of restrictions with moving forward. But what we don't want to do is move forward so fast that we have to screech into reverse. And that does take, I think, a balanced judgment. And I do worry that we're erring too far on the side of opening.
All right.
In the coming weeks.
All right. Well, let's talk about the self-isolation rules. This is the front page of the Daily Mail. Isolation insanity, it says. Furious quarantine rules to last until mid-August, threatening holidays and business. We can also have a look at the front page of The Guardian. Jess's paper fears 10 million may face summer isolation as COVID-19 cases surge. Just do the figures, the analysis by The Guardian, a little bit more detail, Jess, for us on those numbers.
Right, so 2 million people contact COVID this summer. That potentially means that 10 million are going to have to isolate over the next 6 weeks, and that would cause significant disruption to the economy. The thing that the exact thing that politicians hope to get going. And also, if you have 2 million people contracting COVID over the summer, then thankfully, because of the vaccination programme, we're seeing a much lower percentage of those people go into hospital. But a low percentage of 2 million is still a lot of people. And so you still start to put the NHS under the kinds of pressures that we want to avoid. And Chris Whitty said at the press conference on Monday that the modelling they had done suggested that the peak of hospitalisations would still be less than we saw in January. But in January, the NHS came under enormous pressure, and hospital bosses are telling us that they see this the kinds of pressures of this wave being quite similar to the first wave, not the second wave, which was even worse. Yeah. And that kind of thing has bearings on all sorts of things like waiting lists, which are the huge pressures that obviously Sajid Javid wants to get on top of by moving past the pandemic.
Right. I mean, Andrew, do you agree with the policy extending it till August the 16th?
I hope it's not going to be April.
No.
Look, this is something that has to be handled very sensitively and very carefully. The government have to listen to scientists, but they have to make judgments about the overall good of the country. As I said a moment ago, we can't carry on as we are. We have to move forward at some point. The vast majority of people have now had the double vaccine and have the antibodies. Mm-hmm. That's what we were told. Have the vaccine and we can get life back to normal again. We simply have to stick to that. I'm not saying that there isn't room for change if something happens and the government thinks that we need to perhaps do something slightly differently. But at the end of the day, I think the country has to, at some point, make the decision to move forward. And that moment has arrived, so let's get on with it.
Matthew?
Well, we will, in the long term, have to live with COVID. I mean, we have to live with it as we are. I mean, the idea that people are a little more cautious. I mean, I'm desperate to get out of all restrictions and to go back to bars and nightclubs and the old status quo. But the question is how to do it in the most effective way and to provide businesses with the certainty they want over the medium term. So that they can do all the things that they need to do to create profitability and to bring jobs back. So I don't think anyone disagrees about the overall objective, which is to live with the virus. The question is how to do that in the most effective way. And I think it's a really difficult judgment. And I don't envy the politicians having to make these judgments. And I worry a little about the kind of polarization between people who seem utterly convinced of their own position and are incapable of seeing the inherent uncertainty in all of this.
Right. Well, Carolyn, would you like to see the date brought forward to July the 19th when people who are double jabbed won't have to self-isolate if they come into contact with someone who's tested positive because of what the papers are reporting, there could be chaos for business, hospitality?
Yeah, I think I'd probably like to do it the other way round and take July the 19th over to August the 16th. I think what I worry about at the moment is the Prime Minister listening to the facts that the scientists are putting forward, or is he listening to his backbenchers? There's a loud noise on his backbenchers who demanding that we do something quickly. But, Boris's bold move is that unfortunately the virus doesn't listen to
Right, so
Boris
you want
Johnson.
to actually push July the 19th for the ending of restrictions, all of them.
Well, I just
August
think that we need to have a bit of joined up thinking between ending restrictions and the ping, as I call it, because otherwise we're going to have chaos. And until we know exactly what's going to happen in terms of financial support for people who are going to have to self-isolate or people who are going to have COVID and have to stay at home. And we know today that the universal credit uplift is going to will end in September, October. It just seems to me that financially we're doing everything to not support people, and yet we're asking people to comply with a set of rules, which Mr Johnson is putting forward as a result of the noise, the cacophony behind him.
All right, well, let's talk about this BBC News story. 4-day week, an overwhelming success in Iceland, not Ireland, following the world's largest trial of a 4-day working week. 86% of Iceland's workforce have either moved to shorter hours for the same pay or are gaining the right to do so. We can talk to Kate Bell, Head of Economics at the Trades Union Congress. She joins us now to talk about this report. You've written too about the benefits of a 4-day working week for the TUC. Is this the kind of trial you'd like to see run in the UK?
I think it's a really interesting trial, and one of the most important things is that it was negotiated between trade unions, employers and government. So in Iceland, about 90% of the workforce have the right to negotiate their terms and conditions through a trade union, and that's what's enabled them to bring forward this really interesting experience. I think what some of the interesting things about it is it operated differently in different workplaces, but in all of them they did see a reduction in working time with no loss of pay. And I think, that's one of the things that trade unions have always negotiated for, whether it's been, the invention of the weekend or our current call for more bank holidays. So there's definitely interesting lessons we can learn from this.
Right, but explain to our viewers how that would work, because people perhaps will be incredulous by the idea that you can be paid the same for working fewer days or hours.
Well, what we've always called for is the benefits of higher productivity in firms to be shared with workers. And I think some of the details of this trial were really interesting. They looked at their work reorganisation, they looked at holding shorter meetings, they looked at eliminating unnecessary tasks. But, you know, we do hear a lot about the benefits of new technology, how that can make our work more efficient. And shorter working time is one of the ways that, you know, we've always shared those benefits with workers. When the TUC was founded over 150 years ago, average working week was 62 hours. And back then it might have seemed inconceivable that we could move to what is the average working week now, or before the pandemic, of about 32 hours a week. So I think, you know, we should remember change is possible, but of course it needs to be negotiated and work differently in different workplaces.
All right, well, stay with us and listen to the discussion. Andrew, would it work here?
I'm very sceptical of it, to be honest. Iceland is a tiny country with a tiny population the size of 2 London boroughs. I don't think that my constituents, of course they'd like to work less hours, but they're small businessmen, they're market traders, they run shops and businesses and entrepreneurs. To tell them that they have to work sometimes 7 days a week, whilst the public sector workers, they can get the same pay but have less hours, I'm not sure that's going to go down too well in my constituency. I think there'll be more flexible working. I think there will be more opportunities to work at different times of the week. Working from home, there's going to be more of that. Of course there is after the pandemic. But I don't think it's for the government to dictate to people how many days we work. That's for businesses and individuals to decide and negotiate with their employers.
Carolyn, what would your constituents think?
A lot of my constituents couldn't afford to work 4 days a week. A lot of my constituents depend on
but the idea is that they'd be paid the same.
But until we've got the right conditions in workplaces, I'm at a loss to understand how some people who depend on overtime to survive could actually work 4 days a week. I'm not against the idea in principle. I just think that we need to think really carefully about improving the current workplace practices. Standards of pay, standards of hire and fire, for example. We've got so many problems within the current workplace that we need to tackle before we can think about this. And we're also just coming out of a pandemic. I don't think now's the time for the conversation.
Well, Kate, you will have heard both the politicians there. What can you do to convince them otherwise?
Well, I think it's really important that we do look at a broad range of policies around control over working time. As Carolyn was saying, that might be tackling unfair shift scheduling practices. We hear lots of people having their hours cancelled at short notice. It might be, as Andrew was saying, you know, more access to flexible work. And of course, this should be part of a package where we do give workers back more control over when they work, how they work, and of course, how much they work. But I think, you know, we should see this as part of the package that unions will negotiate with employers, that workers will want to talk to their employers about. But, you know, as Carolyn was saying, that principle of no loss of pay is a really, really important one too.
Right. I mean, Jess, we have talked about this before in politics, a perennial subject to some extent. But following on the trial from Iceland, what do you think? Do you think there'll be a change?
I think that over here there is possibly it's more likely to something to do with what Andrew was talking about. It is whether employers, and some employers are moving to this, will allow their employers more time for flexibility at work. We've all seen, I think, during the pandemic, those of us who are lucky enough to kind of work office jobs, if you like, that we've had to be more flexible with our work. We've had to fit it around childcare. We've had to fit it around caring responsibilities. We've had to share home space, and that has led people working all sorts of odd hours and flexible times, potentially even more hours than we would have been doing if we'd have gone into the office. And I think that has led to a bit more of a demand for a better work-life balance. Like Carolyn says, a lot of people can't afford to just cut a day off their work a week. But if you can get the job that you need to do done in the same amount of time, or work slightly longer days and take an extra day off at the weekend, I think that the world is moving towards that kind of flexible shift pattern,
right,
in a huge range of workplaces.
Matthew, do you fancy a 4-day week?
Well, I think we're on the verge of a massive transformation in the way we work, particularly in the high value added sector, creative, complex work, which is driving a lot of the innovation and change. The old industrial idea that, you know, the number of hours you put in determines the amount of output is clearly false. I mean, there's very good psychological evidence that people do their best work when they're in a state of flow, when they're in the zone. And in order to get there, I think you need to stop people need to stop checking their emails and receiving notifications and having completely irrelevant meetings that are undermining productivity. I think the companies that are going to thrive in the modern world are going to reimagine work and give people the opportunity to get into that state of mind where they're being more creative. And the old industrial model will not work for high value added.
Andrew?
Well, that's all very fair. And I think we are at the verge of a big change in how we work. And that's natural. It's an evolution. It's always been an evolution, and it will continue to be. And I think the pandemic will actually push that further forward. But we have to be very careful about telling people that they can earn the same money but do less hours. I think that's not a particularly good message to send out when we've probably lost a massive amount of capacity in terms of work over the last 18 months. A lot of businesses are struggling and may not survive. I think the message is that we should all work harder at the moment to get the economy properly working, back on its feet, and make Britain strong again.
Right, working harder, says Andrew. Kate?
Well, I think we need to look at this business by business. I mean, if you look at some businesses like Amazon, who've done particularly well in the pandemic, I think they probably could afford to share a few more of those profits with their workers and perhaps spend a bit less money putting Jeff Bezos into space. So I do think, there's different situations in different companies. But the most important thing is that workers actually get consulted. Of course, there are workers who desperately need more hours right now. They desperately need more pay. There'll be other people for whom the most important thing right now is another thing we're campaigning for, which is a right to disconnect. So actually being able to sometimes switch off your computer and not be at work and, avoid that blurring of work and family life. But I think there are workplaces, businesses who are doing very well, who've become more productive, who could look again at their working time and how they share some of that wealth with their workforce.
All right, Kate, thank you very much. Just before we move on, though, Carolyn, at the last election, Labour floated a policy of a 32-hour working week, only to run into trouble, as you remember, over whether or not the policy would be applied to NHS workers. Isn't that the issue?
Yeah, I mean, that was resoundingly rejected at the ballot box, so I really don't think we should be worrying about what happened in 2019. New leader, new manifesto, and we haven't made any commitment to either way.
Right, I think that's quite clear on that issue. Thank you very much there, Carolyn. Right, we're going to talk about the Union flag, because last week plans were unveiled for an 8-storey flag to fly on a UK government building in Cardiff. Not everyone is happy, and the pro-independence group Yes Cymru have started a petition to block it. Here it is: stop UK government from placing a giant Union Jack on Cardiff HMRC building. Well, we've helpfully mocked up what the building, well, there it is, that's what it looks like now, and what it will look like when it has the flag over it. Let's talk to Ellen Howell from Yes Cymru. Ellen, welcome to the programme. What's your problem with the UK government flying a Union flag?
Well, to begin with, the whole conversation around the Union flag being placed on this building in Cardiff came about with us recognising the news story and having a conversation about what does this mean to us, what does it mean to our identity, to be flooded with these Union Jacks. And it's quite counterproductive. It works quite differently in Wales to what it might do in other parts of Britain, because, we have our own identity, we understand ourselves as Welsh, and having this Union Jack placed where it is actually a suppression of that reality, of that identity.
Andrew?
Please, come on. Wales is just as much a part of Britain as any other part of the United Kingdom. That's our flag. It brings everyone together. It's a unifying symbol. And to object to a government building flying the Union Jack, the Union flag, the flag of all British people, frankly, it's a disgrace. How can you possibly object to the flag of your country being flown from a government building? Frankly, the only objection I have to the mock, Joe, that I've just seen is that it's only half a Union Jack. I'd like it to be a complete Union Jack right across the building.
Ellen?
The more flags that we fly to promote the strength and the patriotism of this country, the better.
Ellen?
Yeah, so to begin with, my country is Wales, I'm Welsh, and my flag is the Red Dragon. We are part, at the moment, of Britain, but the idea that the Union Jack is the only flag that exists within Britain is false in the first place, and it shows a a misunderstanding of national issues within Wales related to this flag, and it's quite, insensitive in a way to people's identities. And when you feel like your identity is being suppressed, is being excluded from the spaces where we conduct our business or conduct our lives, it's quite deteriorating, and it's quite has quite a negative effect on our confidence. And what we want is a confidence people who can be successful. So I think what this issue shows is misreading by the government of what it means to be a Welsh person in Wales and our relationship with this flag.
Right, well, why not have both? Why not have the Welsh flag as well then, Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely. No problem with that. My town hall in Romford, we fly the Union flag and the Cross of St George. We're in England and we're in the United Kingdom. Being British and being English, being British and being Welsh, they don't conflict. They're the same. We're just different parts of one nation. Yes, Wales is a country, and be proud of flying the Welsh flag, as I'm proud to fly the Cross of St George. Let's not create unnecessary divisions here. Being British is something we should all be proud of.
Ellen?
Why not fly the flag?
Yeah, so definitely the division is in the exclusion of our identity from this action. So it's not been an option to place the Welsh flag there, and there's been no conversation. This issue is specifically a pressing issue because it's being done in Cardiff, which is the Welsh capital city, and you're excluding the flag of that nation. So, this is a specific issue because of the way it's been played and planned and orchestrated by the Westminster government.
All right, Ellen, stay with us. Caroline, I know you're desperate to come in here.
I'm Welsh.
Yes.
I'm Welsh. I'm very proud to be Welsh, but I'm very proud to be British as well. I get the point about not having the Welsh dragon flag on the other side of the building. That would be a good move. But all government buildings, all Welsh government buildings in Wales fly both flags. But if we want to talk about this cultural war, which obviously this campaign is trying to create, I'm going to take you back to VE Day last year, when I stood in front of a Union Jack to commemorate those who'd lost their lives or given their lives during the Second World War, and the vitriol I received from Yes Cymru supporters on Twitter and Facebook criticising me as being anti-Welsh because I was speaking out and paying my respects to many, many thousands of people who'd lost their lives was absolutely appalling. So the cultural war, have it on your own. I'm Welsh, I'm British, I'm proud of both.
Well, Ellen, you'll want to respond to that.
Yes, definitely, please. Thank you. Yeah, so we're not creating a cultural war. We're responding to actions that are being forced upon us as a people. So we're not creating this situation. What we're trying to do is give a voice.
I think they are creating a situation. I'm sorry, but they are. There's no need for social media vitriol when someone is quite proud to be both Welsh and British, which I am, and many millions of people are.
I don't think she's defending it, though.
To state whether they are proud to be British or not. What we're saying is that this flag on a government building that is in a prime position in Cardiff, which is the capital city of Wales, is a bad move. It's the wrong way to go about this.
All right, well,
we should be able to express our national identity.
I don't think many of the Welsh. I don't think many of the Welsh public would agree with our arguments. All right, I think it's a small section.
All right, well, let's just pick up on one thing that Ellen has said with Jess and Matthew. She said it would be counterproductive, Jess. I mean, is this muscular unionism, as it's sometimes called, this sort of campaign by the government, does it risk being counterproductive in that sense?
Yeah, I think that there's obviously a concerted effort to make sure that there is a more visible presence of the Union flag. And before, there used to be a requirement that you'd only fly the flag on certain days, like the Queen's birthday. But now, there's a mandate for it to happen every day, unless there's a very specific other flag being flown, and that the Union flag has to be flown in a superior position to other flags when displayed on government buildings. And it does strike me that this is, this part of a strategy. Unionism is clearly under threat, not just in Scotland, but also in Wales, as we've been hearing. It does seem to me like it's a bit of a kind of easily visual attempt at a strategy to combat independence movements, but I'm not sure it's necessarily going to be the most successful one. It's more of a provocative one rather than a serious one.
Matthew?
Well, I have to say, I used to be very sceptical about the concept of patriotism. I didn't think it included the flag, included mixed race people like me in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up and was on the receiving end of a great deal of racism. I think as I've got older, I've realised that having a strong sense of patriotism is absolutely critical for a successful society. I think the Union has a huge amount to be proud of. We're in the top 5 nations by GDP, outside the top 20 by population. We've incubated many of the great reforms in global history, but I just don't think that flag hugging is necessarily the best manifestation of pride in Britain. It seems to me to be slightly against our traditions, and it'll be interesting to see whether the data shows any increase in support for the Union the more this muscular campaign goes along. If it succeeds, I'm a defender of the Union. I'll support it, but I'm sceptical.
Andrew?
Well, I don't see why we should be sceptical in any sense about being proud of our country. I think one of the bad things that's happened in recent decades is there's been this dreadful political correctness whereby flying the flag somehow seems to be a bad thing to do. And this has created this attitude. I have to say, I don't see it in other countries. Most other countries around the world are very proud of their flag, of their traditions and of their heritage. And I think that Britain has more to be proud of actually than lots of other countries around the world, and we should champion that. And being patriotic and flying the Union flag, the Union Jack, is a good thing. And I think we should do more of it, particularly at schools. I'd like to see every school fly the flag, and for young people to understand the history of our country and why we are such a great nation. And we're a great nation because we are English and Welsh and Irish and Scottish, and plus all the other people that identify with being British as well, including Channel Islands, the Isle of Man, and all of our territories. So let's be proud of that rather than denigrate it.
Matthew?
Well, it depends on the expression of that pride. And I completely accept that one of the fears that I have is the denigration of British history. I think, obviously, like all other powerful nations, the UK has committed certain types of crime, but it's the ahistorical way that is being approached by many people, particularly on the hard left, that I think is a risk to us, because I think we have a huge amount to be proud of. I think we've been, by and large, a progressive force in the world in many different ways. And I think that being able to articulate that in an objective, nuanced and progressive way in our schools is much more important than a diktat or a suggestion that every building flies flags.
Is it being over-politicised, though, Jess, all this discussion around flags and when and where they should be used?
I mean, I think that the discussion around flags, I find it very hard to get worked up one way or the other about flags. I think there are seriously pressing concerns about the Union. There are seriously pressing concerns about the future of Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom, mainly down to deals that have been negotiated by this government and are having the effect of making people in Northern Ireland feel like they're a particular separate nation. The way that in Wales and in Scotland, leaders there have had significant platforms to do very different pandemic responses, which has allowed people there to really envisage what it might be like to run themselves as independent nations. All of these things, I think, require very deep thinking about the future of the Union. And I'm not sure that we're going to get to that deep thinking by having a row about a flag on a building.
Right. Well, on that, though, Carolyn, Welsh Labour has stopped members of the Senedd from flying flags in their Zoom backgrounds.
Yeah, it's not Welsh Labour, it's the Clywedd, the Speaker at the Assembly.
Right.
So the Speaker at the Senedd has asked that no one flies any kind of flag. I believe it was some...
And do you think that's right?
That's a matter for the Senedd. We have colleagues who wave flags behind them in Westminster, but it is an administrative decision by the Speaker of the Senedd. All right,
Ellen, just before you go, anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, so I think the important thing to realise here when we're talking about this in a Welsh context is that fact that the visual cues that reinforce our identity have been deteriorating over a number of years. We've seen it with food. We're seeing it with these massive oppressive flags being pushed down our throats now. And what that's doing is having a detrimental effect on our confidence as people. And we would like to, address that issue.
All right, well, lots of sighs from the studio here from Carolyn and Andrew, and shaking of heads, Ellen, which I'm sure you've read now throughout this piece. We're going to move on to talk about universal credit. As you know, there has been an awful lot of discussion and debate about whether the £20 increase should be retained in the long term. Let's listen to what the Work and Pensions Secretary, Therese Coffey, had to say when she was asked by MPs about it.
Well, ahead of October, we will start communicating with the current claimants who receive the £20 to make them aware that that will be being phased out, and they will start to see an adjustment in their payments. I think it really kicks in largely in October, but it will start to kick in, I think, towards late September for some people.
Well, Jess, that was Therese Coffey. The government had been considering this, but they're obviously not going to change their minds.
Yes, and I thought it was interesting later on that Therese Coffey in that evidence said that it was a collective decision when she was asked whether she agreed with it. And we know pretty much that she was very much against there being this cut in the uplift when Rishi Sunak ahead of the budget decided to extend it. It sounds, reading between the lines, that she's not necessarily prepared to put up that fight again. And the question will be now, I think, whether we see Tory MPs, 6 of whom voted with Labour in a motion to try and stop the uplift being cut ahead of the budget, and then it was extended, and whether they're prepared to go to the wall again for it. I think the mood feels like in the Tory party that they want now, that there's very much a mood to move on with the pandemic, with people vaccinated. It's not the same situation as in January, but there are still going to be a lot of heartrending stories, a lot of people who are going to fall into much deeper poverty if this happens, and we'll see whether that affects the views of Tory MPs in the run-up to this.
Andrew?
We have to get things back to normal again, and therefore we have to go back to where we were before. We can't just use what happened during the pandemic as a permanent way forward. Now, that's not to say that there are going to be people that will need special help. There should be a safety net for those in genuine need. But the idea we just continue as if we're still in the pandemic, that can't happen. We have to move out of this, and we have to ensure that, frankly, our country's finances are put back in good order again. Right. We cannot spend money and borrow money forever without having to guard against the huge debt we're going to hand to future generations.
Right,
so
well,
it's responsible to do this.
Colleagues of yours, 6 former Work and Pension Secretaries, disagree with you, Andrew, including Ian Duncan-Smith. Are they wrong?
I think that this is a balance. It has to be judged very carefully. I think there are people that quite like getting the extra £20, but maybe they don't need it. So there needs to be proper... Because people are all different in different circumstances. So you can't box everyone into the same category, but the government has an overall responsibility to deal with the national finances as well. And that's what they must now do.
So Ian Duncan-Smith's wrong?
I think that there needs to be a balance to this. He may not be wrong in all situations, but to have this blanket benefit uplifted permanently, I don't think is sustainable.
Well, I'm going to defend Ian Duncan-Smith and say he's absolutely right, and we're taking £20 away from the people who can least afford to lose it. And nobody who's on universal credit would be not in need of more money, I can assure you of that. I mean, what may be a cup of coffee and a nice slice of cake to some people, 20 quid, is actually food for a week for other people. This is not the time to be doing this. They should have that £20. It should be a definite,
should it be blanket,
ongoing.
permanent?
Well, yeah. I mean, if need be, yeah.
No flexibility.
Exactly. It should be there. £20 is nothing. It's nothing to the likes of people who can afford £20 to go out and, like I said, have a cup of coffee and a nice piece of cake. But it's a lifeline to people who are actually on universal credit and struggling to put meal on the table.
Are you prepared to take that lifeline away, as Carolyn puts it?
No. As I've said, if someone is in desperate need and the family really need that support, there should be a safety net. There should be flexibility in the system. What I'm against is government giving handouts permanently, well, whatever you want to call it, but to give benefits permanently to people without proper assessments
and
as to whether they need that.
And do you make it sound like a charity? It's not charity. This is a basic standard of living for people, for whatever reason, have not got an individual, another way of an income.
As I say, if someone's in genuine need, the government should be there for them.
It's not charity. But it's not a handout.
I'm very sceptical of blanket benefits like this. I think it should be targeted at people in genuine need.
Right. They are in need.
And it's how do you assess that need? Are you saying that universal credit has been a resounding success in terms of making sure that those who need it get it?
No, nothing is a resounding success. There are always pitfalls with any system, but we have to be responsible about this, and the government have to ensure that the finances are there to fund all these things in the future. At the moment, we're in the biggest debt in the history of this country, so the government can't just spend money we don't have. Otherwise, we're handing over the debt to the next generation.
All right, we've got Prime Minister's questions coming up in a few minutes' time. Matthew, how do you see this discussion?
Well, I think not just in the UK, but across the Western world, many of the dysfunctions that manifest themselves in the issues we've been discussing today are to do with economic inequality and the fact that the proceeds of growth are being disproportionately captured by the top 1%. Individual nation states, I don't think, can solve this on their own. There's a massive problem with tax avoidance by big multinational companies, offshoring. I think also that they're not paying their workers as much as they could. They're squeezing it. They have disproportionate power in a globalized world. And I think it needs international coordination to rectify these dysfunctions, because the biggest beneficiary of this, I think, taking a bigger perspective, is China. And if we don't address it soon, we're going to be in very serious trouble.
Andrew, the Institute of Fiscal Studies say that £20 a week to some families could constitute 20% of their income. You can't answer the questions because it's Prime Minister's questions. Thank you to my guests.
7 London bombings. We remember the 52 innocent people who lost their lives and those who were injured, and pay tribute to the city's emergency services for their heroic response. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House will wish to join me in sending condolences to the family and friends of Sislin Faye Allen, who died earlier this week. She was the UK's first black female police officer, and she served in the Metropolitan Police. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure colleagues will also want to join me in wishing the England football team the best of luck for tonight's semi-final against Denmark. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
John Macmillan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, we hear a great deal in this place about the rule of law and injustice. Can the Prime Minister tell me what he's going to do about the injustice that my constituents in Falkirk, indeed families up and down the UK, are facing every day because of the retrospective loan charge that is fast turning into the next post office scandal? The hounding by HMRC, clearly out of control, accountable to no one, has managed to hoodwink, mislead his own Treasury ministers. And now, according to the head of HMRC, the retrospective loan charge appears to be without any legal basis or justification. Therefore, will the Prime Minister accept this matter needs further and immediate investigation?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm acutely aware, as I think all colleagues are around the House, of the pain suffered by those who entered into loan charge schemes, and I think, alas, that they were misguided to do so. But I think that the line taken by the Treasury, I'm afraid, is right on this.
Let's go to John Stevenson. John.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, there is more that unites us than divides us is very true of the United Kingdom. However, improved connectivity is vital to ensuring we remain united. The government's recent interim connectivity review has suggested some improvements. If this is really going to happen, then improvements must be made to the A75, the A69, and to the extension of the Borders Railway. Does the Prime Minister support such investment, and what is the timescale for such investment?
I thank my honourable friend for his excellent question. I think he should not have too long to wait for the final recommendations from Sir Peter Hendy about the A75 and other great features of union connectivity which this government hopes to support. But we've already agreed £5 million from the UK and the Scottish governments to support the extension of the Edinburgh-Tweedbank Borders Railway to Carlisle.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his remarks about the 7/7 anniversary? I remember where I was on that day and will never forget it. I'm sure that's the same for everybody, and we will never forget all those affected, especially the family and friends of all those who died. Can I join the Prime Minister in his comments about Faelon as well, and also about football, and wish the very best of luck to the England football team this evening. I'm sure the whole country, with the possible exception of the Conservative MP for Ashfield, will be watching this evening and cheering England on. Mr Speaker, can I also extend a special welcome to the new member for Batley and Spen? And will members opposite forgive me if I just turn round to look at the new member for Batley and Spen as she sits there on these benches beneath the plaque to Jo Cox, her sister. And that's a special and emotional moment for all of us on these benches. And I think for everybody across this House, it takes incredible courage and bravery to stand in that constituency and to sit on these benches beneath that plaque. Mr Speaker, we all want our economy to open and to get back to normal. The question is whether we do it in a controlled way or a chaotic way. The Health Secretary told the House yesterday that under the government's plan, infections could go as high as 100,000 a day. Now, a number of key questions fall from that. First, if infections reach that level, 100,000 per day, what does the Prime Minister expect the number of hospitalisations, deaths, and the number of people with long COVID will be in that eventuality?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, there are a number of projections and they're available from the SPI-M graphs, but it's certainly true, Mr Speaker, that we are seeing a wave of cases because of the Delta variant, but scientists are also absolutely clear that we have severed the link between infection and serious disease and death. And currently there are only a 30th of the deaths that we were seeing at an equivalent position in previous waves of this pandemic. And that has been made possible thanks to the vaccine rollout, the fastest of any European country. And I think what people would like to hear from the party opposite, because I wasn't quite clear from that opening question, is whether or not they support the progress that this country is intending to make on July the 19th or not, Mr Speaker. He says it's reckless to go ahead. Does that mean he's opposing it?
Mr Speaker, we know that the link between infection rates and deaths has been weakened, but it hasn't been broken. And the Prime Minister must, and he certainly should know the answer to the question that I asked him. That he won't answer it here in the House hardly inspires confidence in his plan. Mr Speaker, let's be clear why infection rates are so high. Because the Prime Minister let the Delta, or we can call it the Johnson variant, into the country. And let's be clear why the number of cases will surge so quickly, because he is taking all protections off in one go. That is reckless. The SAGE papers yesterday, Mr Speaker, make clear that with high infection rates, there's a greater chance of new variants emerging, greater pressure on the NHS, more people will get long COVID, and test and trace will be less effective. Knowing all that, is the Prime Minister really comfortable with a plan that means 100,000 people catching this virus every day and everything that entails?
Mr Speaker, I really think we need to hear from what the Honourable Gentleman what he actually supports. We will continue with a balanced and reasonable approach. And I've given the reasons. This country has rolled out the fastest vaccination programme anywhere in Europe. The vaccines provide more than 90% protection against hospitalisation, both of them, Mr Speaker. By the 19th of July, we will have vaccinated, every adult will have been offered one vaccination. Everybody over 40, Mr Speaker, will have been offered two vaccinations. That is an extraordinary achievement. That's allowing us to go ahead. Now, last week, Mr Speaker, or earlier this week, he seemed to support opening up getting rid of the 1 metre rule. He seemed to support getting back into nightclubs and getting back into pubs without masks, Mr. Speaker. But if he doesn't support it, perhaps he could clear it up now. Is it reckless or not, Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, we should open up in a controlled way. Keeping base licence protections such as masks on public transport, improving ventilation, making sure the track and trace system remains effective, and ensuring proper payments for self-isolation. The Prime Minister can't just wish away the practical problems that 100,000 infections a day are going to cause. Can't wish them away. The next obvious one is the huge number of people who will be asked to isolate. If there are 100,000 infections a day, that means hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people are going to be pinged to isolate. The Financial Times estimates this morning that could be around 2 million people per week. The Mail says 3.5 million people a week. Either way, it's a massive number. It means huge disruption to families and businesses just as the summer holidays begin. So we know what the FT thinks. We know what the Mail thinks, what their estimates are. Can the Prime Minister tell us how many people does he expect will be asked to isolate if infection rates continue to rise at this rate?
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank everybody who self-isolates. They're doing the right thing. They're a vital part of this country's protection against the disease. And what we will be doing is moving away from self-isolation towards testing in the course of the next few weeks. And that is the prudent approach, because we will have, Mr. Speaker, vaccinated even more people. But what he can't explain, well, he can't have it both ways. He says it's reckless. It's reckless to open up, Mr. Speaker, and yet he attacks self-isolation, Mr. Speaker, which is one of the key protections that this country has. And let me ask him again. On Monday, he seemed to say he was in favour. He seemed to say he was in favour of opening up on July the 19th. Now he's saying it's reckless. Which is it, Mr. Speaker?
Maybe I can help a little. Just to remind us that it's Prime Minister's questions. If we want opposition questions, we'll need to change standing up. Yes.
The question was simply how many people are going to be asked to self-isolate if there's 100,000 infections a day, and he won't answer it. And we know why he won't answer it and pretends I'm asking a different question. He ignored the problems in schools. Now there's 700,000 children off per week because he ignored it. Now he's ignoring the next big problem that's heading down the track and going to affect millions of people who have to self-isolate. Now, it won't feel like Freedom Day to those who have to isolate, when they're having to cancel their holidays, when they can't go to the pub or even to their kids' sports day. And it won't feel like Freedom Day, Prime Minister, to the businesses who are already warning of carnage because of the loss of staff and customers. It must be obvious, with case rates that high, his plan risks undermining the track and trace system that he spent billions and billions of pounds on. Prime Minister, there are already too many stories of people deleting the NHS app. He must have seen those stories. And they're doing it because they can see what is coming down the track. Now, of course, we don't support that, Mr. Speaker, but under his plan, it's entirely predictable. What is the Prime Minister going to do to stop people deleting the NHS track because they can see precisely what he can't see, which is millions of them are going to be pinged this summer to self-isolate?
Mr. Speaker, of course we're going to continue with the programme of self-isolation for as long as that is necessary. I thank all those who are doing it. But of course, what we're also doing is moving to a system of testing rather than self-isolation, and we can do that because of the massive rollout of the vaccine programme. And what I'm still not, I think about the fourth or fifth time, Mr. Speaker, it's still not clear whether he's actually in favour of this country moving forward to step 4 on the basis of the massive rollout of vaccine. And yes, of course, Mr. Speaker, this is unlike the law, where you can attack from lots of different positions at once. To oppose, you must have a credible and clear alternative. And I simply do not hear that. Is he in favour of us moving forward, yes or no? It's completely impossible to tell.
Just to, once again, it's Prime Minister's questions and the Prime Minister answers questions. Keir Starmer.
If he stopped mumbling and listened, he'd have heard the answer the first time. We want to open in a controlled way and keep in line baseline protections that can keep down infections, like mandatory face masks on public transport. Now, we know that will protect people, reduce the speed of the virus and the spread of the virus, and it won't harm the economy. It's common sense. Why can't the Prime Minister see that?
Prime Minister.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, we can see that it's common sense for people in confined spaces to wear a face mask out of respect and courtesy to others, but such as on the tube. But what we're doing, Mr. Speaker, is cautiously, prudently moving from legal diktat to allowing people to take personal responsibility for their actions. And that is the right way forward, Mr. Speaker. And I must say that if really that is the only difference between us, if he supports absolutely everything else, so opening pubs, opening nightclubs, getting rid of the 1 metre rule, getting people back to work, and it's all about whether the difference between making face masks mandatory or advisory on the tube. If that is the only difference between us, Mr. Speaker, then that is good news. But I'd like to hear him clarify that.
Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, he agrees it's common sense because it protects the public, but he won't make it mandatory. It's ridiculous. It's clear what this is all about. He's lost a health secretary. He's lost a by-election, and he's getting flack from his own MPs. So he's doing what he always does, crashing over to the other side of the aisle, chasing headlines and coming up with a plan that hasn't been thought through. We all want restrictions lifted, we want our economy open, and we want to get back to normal. But we've been here too many times before. Isn't it the case that once again, instead of a careful, controlled approach, we're heading for a summer of chaos and confusion?
Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, is the answer to that. These are difficult decisions. They need to be taken in a balanced way, and that's what we're doing. And throughout the pandemic, to do all these things, frankly, Mr. Speaker, takes a great deal of drive, and it takes a great deal of leadership to get things done. And if we'd followed his advice, Mr. Speaker, we would still be in the European Medicines Agency, and we would never have rolled out the vaccines as fast. If we'd followed his advice, Mr. Speaker, we would never have got schools open again with all the damage to kids' education. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, if we listened to him, we would not now be proceeding cautiously, pragmatically, sensibly to reopen our society and our economy and give people back the chance to enjoy the freedoms they love. We're getting on with taking the tough decisions to take this country forward, Mr. Speaker. We vaccinate, they vacillate, we inoculate, Mr. Speaker, while they're invertebrate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I visited Penketh South Primary School in Warrington to talk to Year 6 children about how we can generate cleaner energy in the future. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that as well as backing electric vehicle production in the North West, there's a great opportunity to shift towards low-carbon hydrogen by providing support for projects such as HyNet Northwest, which by 2030 will secure thousands of green jobs in the Northwest, as well as by cutting emissions to the same level as taking 4 million cars off the roads?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the North West, in addition to the rest of this country, can be a world leader, will be a world leader in hydrogen technology, and I think the HyNet project is an excellent example. We've already put 45 million into supporting the HyNet project, kick-starting hydrogen capture and storage, and I thank him for his support.
We now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I wish England all the best for the football match tonight against Denmark, and I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister on the tragedy of the bombing of 7/7 that we all remember so vividly. And also, Mr. Speaker, yesterday was the 33rd anniversary of the Piper Alpha disaster, where 167 people cruelly lost their lives. And our thoughts are very much with the friends and family that are still grieving over the terrors of that event. And finally, before I move on, this is also Srebrenica Memorial Week, and we should be remembering those that have suffered at genocide, whether that be in Bosnia, in the Holocaust, in Rwanda and many other places. And perhaps the Prime Minister will meet with me to discuss how we can help the Srebrenica charity here in the UK. Mr Speaker, this week the Tory government introduced its so-called electoral integrity bill. In reality, the bill is designed to do anything but increase the integrity of our elections. It is a solution in desperate search of a problem that simply does not exist. What the bill will do is to impose for the first time Trumpian voter ID laws in the UK. The Electoral Reform Society says it could lead to voter disenfranchisement on an industrial scale. Disenfranchising people from working class communities, BME communities and others already marginalised in society, creating barriers to vote. Prime Minister, why is this Tory government trying to rob people of their democratic right to vote?
Mr Speaker, what we're trying to protect is the democratic right of people to have a one-person, one-vote system. And I'm afraid that I have personal experience. I remember vividly what used to go on in Tower Hamlets. And I think it is important that we move to some sort of voter ID, and plenty of other countries have it, and I think it's eminently sensible, and people, I think, will be reassured that their votes matter, and that's what this bill is about.
Goodness gracious, Prime Minister, come on. There were 34 allegations of impersonation in 2019. This is a problem that does not exist. It is a British Prime Minister seeking to make it harder to vote, because it's easier to get re-elected if the government can choose their voters, rather than letting the voters choose their government. Mr Speaker, 3.5 million people in the United Kingdom do not have a form of photo ID. 11 million people do not have a passport or driver's licence. These millions of people will be directly impacted by seeing their right to vote curtailed. And it's not just the opposition saying this. Members of the Prime Minister's own party have called his plans an illogical and illiberal solution to a non-existent problem. Mr Speaker, will the Prime Minister withdraw these vote-rigging proposals immediately, or he will continue down the path of being a tin-pot dictator?
Well, Mr Speaker, look, I think he's making a bit of a mountain out of a molehill, if I may respectfully suggest. Councils will be under an obligation to provide free photo ID to anybody who wants it, and I do think it reasonable to protect the public in our elections from the idea of voter fraud. Nobody wants to see it. And by the way, I don't think that elections in this country should be in any way clouded or contaminated by the suspicion of voter fraud, and that's what we're trying to prevent.
Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I was pleased to see my right honourable friend in Cornwall for a very successful G7 summit. Whilst I know he didn't manage to get to South East Cornwall, I can assure him that Looe is a very beautiful coastal town. The problem is Looe floods regularly. Will my right honourable friend speak to government departments to get this sorted?
Through my honourable friend, just thank again the people of Cornwall, South East Cornwall, everybody. It was a wonderful hospitality that the G7 had, and I assure her that I'm aware of the problem of the flooding in Looe, and I can tell her that my right honourable friend, the Environment Secretary, has met Cornwall Council to discuss the matter, and we will do everything we can to sort it out.
Neil Hanby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to add my voice on behalf of the Albion Party to the comments about 7-7. On the morning of 7-7, I was in a meeting at UCLH A&E as the information started coming through, and I would pay tribute to every single one of those frontline staff that I worked alongside on that day. It was a long shift, and it was a long walk home that evening. The Prime Minister talks about vaccines. Accurate surveillance is really important as well. It's equally as important. And on the 15th of March, the Department of Health and Social Care Minister, Lord Bethell, on Twitter said that Omega Diagnostics and Willogic we're in line for 2 million lateral flow device order per day by the end of May. Promised jobs and security. So can the Prime Minister explain why his government is undermining the superior domestic diagnostics tests while propping up discredited Chinese imports to the tune of £3 billion?
Thank the honourable gentleman. I don't think that's an entirely fair characterisation of what the government is doing. On the contrary, we have worked night and day to build up our domestic lateral flow capacity and continue to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, President Xi cheerily threatened that any foreigners attempting to influence China will have their heads bashed against the Great Wall of Steel. And of course, he's still in denial about human rights violations and the genocides in Xinjiang and Tibet, as recognised by this House, and as a result of which 5 of us remained sanctioned. So will the Prime Minister therefore support our motion to be debated in this House next Thursday, calling for a diplomatic boycott of the 2022 Winter Olympics, incredibly awarded to Beijing, until and unless this dangerous regime abides by basic international standards of decency?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, but this country has led the world in condemning human rights abuses in Xinjiang, in putting sanctions on those responsible, in holding companies to account that import goods made with forced labour in Xinjiang. And I will certainly consider the proposal debated, but I must say that I'm instinctively and always have been against sporting boycotts, Mr.
And the Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister and others on the anniversaries being marked today. Now, this Sunday, 11th July, marks 2 years since the Government committed to reforming a cruel aspect of the welfare system, which forces terminally ill people to prove that they have 6 months or less to live before they're granted fast access to benefits. And the Motor Neuron Disease Association, Marie Curie, estimate in that time 7,000 people have died waiting for a decision on their benefits claim. And with the pandemic and the NHS managing that and the backlog of diseases, this situation will only become more acute. When will the Government publish its review and finally scrap the 6-month rule as it has committed to do so?
I'm great. Thank you, the Honourable Lady. I'm aware of the issue that she's raised. To the best of my knowledge, we are making that change, but I will write to her as soon as I have that information.
David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst the extension of the grace period for the supply of chilled meat from Great Britain to Northern Ireland is welcome, Lord Frost is entirely right to say that it amounts in truth to no more than a temporary sticking plaster. So can my right honourable friend please confirm that unless the European Union adopts a more proportionate approach to the application of the Northern Ireland Protocol, this country will do whatever it is necessary, legislative or otherwise, to fix the problem permanently?
My right honourable friend is sadly completely right in his analysis. There remain very serious problems in the what I believe is the misapplication, the excessively legally purist application of that deal and of that protocol. And what we are hoping for is some progress from the European Commission, some repairs that I think that they should make to the way this is working. But to echo what he has said, we certainly rule nothing out in our approach.
Angela Crawley.
Prime Minister, 1 in 4 pregnancies end in miscarriage, and therefore does the Prime Minister agree that parents' grief for this profound loss is not an illness? Therefore, parents should receive formal miscarriage leave rather than resort to sick pay or unpaid leave if their pregnancy miscarriage occurs before 24 weeks. Will the Prime Minister support my private member's bill and introduce paid miscarriage leave for parents?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I sympathise deeply with anybody who's suffered the loss of a baby by miscarriage, of course. And what I can tell her is that we did introduce in 2020 paid parental bereavement leave, but that entitles those who lose a child after 24 weeks of pregnancy to some payment. But of course, nothing I can say, and no payment we could make would be any consolation to those who experience a miscarriage in that way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Serious Fraud Office achieved a rare success in Southwark Crown Court in April with a successful prosecution of GPT special projects, which resulted in £28 million of penalties for corruption. The key whistleblower in this case was my constituent Ian Foxley, without whom the prosecution would never have happened. Yet he's been totally hung out to dry by the Serious Fraud Office, despite 10 years of financial devastation. Does my right honourable friend agree that unless we properly compensate whistleblowers, they simply will not come forward? And would he consider making a payment out of the £28 million received by the HM Treasury to compensate him for his losses?
Well, I thank him for his excellent question. I want to thank Mr. Foxley for his whistleblowing, because he has seen justice done. The trouble is we don't normally compensate whistleblowers in the way that he recommends, but I know that my right honourable friend, the Solicitor General, has offered to meet my honourable friend to discuss the matter further.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, we celebrated the 73rd birthday of the NHS, one of the very best things about our country. Now, many of us on this side of the House and our constituents remain committed to protect the fundamental right of universal healthcare free at the point of delivery. But this government remains a constant threat to our public health service. No staff pay rise, a 25% cut in the number of mental health beds, and the widespread sell-off of GP practices like the Edith Cavell surgery in my constituency to American private insurance giant Centene. And also, just to mention, the Health and Care Bill, which will only open the doors for privatisation wider. Why is the Prime Minister continuing to eviscerate our most essential public services? And why won't he listen to the thousands of essential workers who demonstrated on Saturday to end NHS privatisation, end chronic underfunding and understaffing, and keep the NHS public?
Mr. Speaker, I don't think with great respect to the lady opposite, member opposite, I don't think I've ever heard a question that was more inversely related to reality. This is a government that from the beginning invested the biggest amount in the NHS for a generation. Then in the last year we put another £92 billion, Mr. Speaker, into frontline care. We've increased nurses' pay starting pay by 12.8% over the last 3 years. And above all, Mr. Speaker, we're not only building 48 more hospitals, but there are another 59,000 people working in the NHS this year than there were this time last year. This is a government that is putting our NHS first.
Let's go to Kate Griffiths. Kate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House welcomes the fantastic news of Nissan's investment in an electric battery gigafactory in Sunderland. But does the Prime Minister agree with me that batteries are only part of the solution in pursuit of net zero by 2050, and that zero carbon hydrogen combustion engines, such as those recently developed by Midlands-based JCB, have an important role to play in our country's decarbonisation plans?
Minister.
My honourable friend is completely right, because the investments that we're seeing just in the last week or so, the Sunderland investment by Nissan, the gigafactory in Sunderland, what Stellantis are doing at Ellesmere Port, these are tremendously exciting for battery-powered vehicles. It's fantastic, but we must not forget hydrogen, Mr. Speaker. As I said in an earlier answer, we want this country to be a world leader in hydrogen technology as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the Prime Minister is aware of the fatal and serious accidents road accidents that have taken place on St Albans Road and Redbourne Road in my constituency. Could the Prime Minister advise the House and advise me on what more the government is doing to improve road safety, not just in the case of fatal accidents, but often where there are serious accidents or near misses, because this is an issue that's of growing concern to many of my constituents and I believe to many across the country.
I thank my honourable friend, and he's right to raise this. Although those who've been killed or seriously injured on the roads has been coming down over a long period of time, it is vital that we invest in this. We put another £100 million through the Safer Roads Fund to invest in 50 of the most dangerous stretches on A roads, and I also draw his attention to the Think campaign, which can play a huge role in reducing deaths and serious injuries on our roads.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To their bitter disappointment, and despite the assurances given during the fire safety bill that it would do so, the building safety bill published on Monday does little to help the hundreds of thousands of leaseholders who right now face financial ruin as a result of the building safety crisis. My question to the Prime Minister is a simple one. Why is his government seemingly intent on failing to honour the commitments given to those leaseholders and members of this House by refusing to legislate to fully protect all the blameless victims of this scandal?
But that's not accurate, Mr. Speaker. We are continuing to support all those who have to remediate their buildings, and I just remind you the £5 billion that we've provided is 5 times, Mr. Speaker, what Labour offered to support in their last manifesto, and we will make sure that all the leaseholders, people who have suffered from the consequences of the Grenfell conflagration, do get the advice and the support they need.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will recognise the huge service done by independent hospices to those at the end of their lives, to their families and to the NHS, because these people would likely otherwise be in hospital. He will also understand the huge impact that the COVID pandemic has had on the fundraising capacity of these hospice charities. So can I ask him to consider carefully and personally the case that is being made by independent hospices for greater government support for their clinical costs, costs which, if they were no longer there, would undoubtedly be borne by the taxpayer and by the hard-pressed NHS.
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend, and he's totally right to draw attention to the incredible selfless work of hospices up and down the country, charitable hospices. They do receive £350 million of government funding annually. He's right to draw attention to the particular difficulties they've had in fundraising, and that's this year over the pandemic, and that's why they've received an additional £257 million in national grant funding arrangements.
Let's go to Imran Hussain. Imran.
Mr. Speaker, in January, the Prime Minister promised me that he would listen to the calls of those that the government had excluded from vital support to protect their jobs, businesses and incomes during the coronavirus pandemic. Yet over the last 6 months, many of my constituents are still coming to tell me that they have been shut off and ignored, and millions across the country continue to be excluded. So I have to ask the Prime Minister, why did he give those who have been excluded false hope instead of the support they desperately needed?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman. Of course, I know how tough it has been for millions of people up and down the country. I know how tough it has been for business. But that's why this government put in an extraordinary £407 billion to support jobs and livelihoods across the country throughout the pandemic. And the single most important thing we can do now for the individuals, for the families that he represents and that he's rightly talking about today, is to help our country to get back on its feet by cautiously opening up in the way that we are on July the 19th. If we can take that step, which I very much hope that we will. I hope that it may command the support, if not of the Leader of the Opposition, then at least of him.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The River Test is one of the finest chalk streams in the world, but since May, diesel has been spilling into the river. What matters most is that the flow is stopped and that there is an effective clean-up. But there are many agencies involved, which has made a coordinated response challenging. Please will my right honourable friend make sure the Environment Agency, Natural England, Southern Water, local authorities and DEFRA are all involved to solve this environmental catastrophe together?
I thank my right honourable friend. She's completely right. All those bodies are involved, but the lead agency is the Environment Agency. I know that they're in touch with her, and I must say I have a very high regard for them and for their work.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure the Prime Minister actually welcomed the news.
We're going to leave PMQ's Prime Minister's questions at that point. If there is anything new, development-wise, we will bring it to you. Let me welcome our guests for this part of the programme. Alex Chalk, Justice Minister for the Government. Hello to you. Steve Reid, Shadow Communities and Local Government Secretary for the Labour Party. Hello to you too. And Laura Kunsberg, the BBC's political editor. Unsurprisingly, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, focused almost entirely his questions on whether or not lifting pretty well all the restrictions on July the 19th 19th in England was reckless.
That's right, Joe, and I don't think we should be surprised he raised that. Let's not forget, this is a huge change that is about to come after more than a year of living with all of these things in this part of the UK, at least. And of course, since the government's announcement on Monday, there's been really intense political, scientific and medical debate about whether it's the right thing to do or not. What was interesting is that Keir Starmer tried to get the same information that journalists have been trying to get from the government in the last few days. What does the government expect in terms of new hospitalisations? What does the government expect in terms of the number of people who may lose their lives over the next couple of months? And Boris Johnson just didn't want to give those figures. Now, our viewers probably have heard the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, said we might be looking at 50,000 cases a day. We might even be looking at 100,000 cases a day. But the government just won't release the extra information, and Keir Starmer didn't get anywhere with that. One other thing that was interesting to me from a political point of view, he tried to brand the Delta variant the Johnson variant.
Yes.
And he even referred to Boris Johnson as crashing around from aisle to aisle. Viewers have probably heard his nickname in Number 10 was the Trolley. It's an unusual kind of cheekiness from Keir Starmer actually doing that. He sometimes, you know, holds back from those kinds of things, but maybe he's feeling more chipper after the Batley by-election result.
Oh, well, let's just pick up on that with Steve. Was that fair to label it the Johnson variant rather than the Delta variant?
I think it is fair comment, actually, because if you think what happened, how did the Delta virus get here in the first place? Well, the government, the Prime Minister, saw that the virus was raging across the Indian subcontinent. They put Pakistan and Bangladesh on the red list, but they left India on the green list because the Prime Minister was still intending to go to New Delhi and visit the Indian Prime Minister. And then when he finally had to face reality that this simply wasn't the right or the safe thing to do, he announced on a Monday that India would be going on the red list on the Friday. And in those intervening 5 days, 20,000 people travelled from India back to the United Kingdom and seeded the Delta virus across our country. And that is the problem we're facing now. Now, that was a decision that Boris Johnson took, and it was a very, very reckless decision that has now left us in a far more insecure position as we look towards ending all of the restrictions on the 19th of July than we would have been otherwise. I think the point Keir's making is, having already taken one very reckless decision that's left us in a worse position,
yes,
please don't do it again on the 19th.
Right, well, Alex, is that fair description then, the Johnson variant?
No, I actually thought that was a pretty shabby ad hominem attack, as a matter of fact. Look, and once again, Labour are trying to reinvent history. The reality was that the decision to ban people from India coming to the UK happened before it happened in France and Germany, point one. And point two is it was 2 weeks before the WHO said that this was a variant of concern. And by the way, even before they considered it a variant of interest. So this is... This is classic historical revisionism, and I think to label it a Johnson variant is shabby and undermining. I'm very happy to deal with that. The issue, so far as Pakistan was concerned, as you well know, is that the incidence of people coming to the UK who were testing positive was higher from those countries. So this is classic this is classic hindsight, and they weren't making these points at the time. They weren't making these points at the time, and I think it's really regrettable that it's happening in this way.
All right, we're going to talk about the numbers that Laura mentioned at the beginning and see if you can help us a little bit with them, Alex, because as we know, the Health Secretary talked about possibly reaching 100,000 new cases every day over the summer. Now, even with the vaccine programme, a proportion of those people will end up in hospital and a smaller proportion, tragically, will lose their lives. Do you have figures for how many?
Well, look, the real point is this, as the Prime Minister indicated, there's SPY and people can go and look up what they want to look up. But the central point is this. What the scientists have told us is that the connection between infections and death has been dramatically weakened. And we have got to get to the point, if not now, when, about whether we are going to open up as a society. And what I thought was so telling is that Keir Starmer did not indicate, is he in favour of us moving to stage 4?
I'll come to that. I'll come to that in a moment.
Or is he not? And I just think, you know...
Yeah.
We've got to the point where we've built these defences. So
Yes.
what are we going to do with these defences? And I think that's a really important
But
point.
on the
You know,
issue-
the whole point of but the restrictions were to protect the NHS.
Yes.
And we've got to the point on the basis of advice that we're in a position to do that.
Right, but on the issue of getting the balance right, which is what Boris Johnson said, he called it a balanced and reasonable approach. How on earth can you be convinced of that or convince voters of that if you don't have the numbers? Or do you have the numbers on hospitalisation?
But this is precisely why the government takes advice. And you will have heard the Prime Minister come to Number 10, and Sajid Javid spoke in the Commons as well. But there was the Chief Scientific Officer, the Chief Medical Officer, making these points, standing side by side to indicate now is the right moment. Listen, we should be clear. There is no absolute certainty about anything. And of course, we take the advice, see what's happening in Israel and elsewhere. But it's about taking a balanced and proportionate situation. And the last point I'll make is, look, it's not a risk-free option not to progress. Look at those hospitality businesses. Look at those schools, those school children who've been affected. Look at people with mental health issues. So to simply say, oh, well, look, don't take a risky approach or whatever, there are risks in doing nothing. And that's got to be a part of the balanced assessment as well.
But Minister, it's Laura here. You just said that people can go and look up these numbers if they want. That is not true. Journalists have repeatedly asked, Keir Starmer repeatedly asked this week, for the government's expectations for the number of people who will be taken to hospital, the numbers of people who may sadly lose their lives. That information is not being put in the public domain. Now, if you want people to have confidence in the decisions that have been taken, which, as you rightly suggest, no one's saying they should be risk-free, but why not publish that information?
Well, look, the whole approach has been, if I may say so, characterised by being very open and transparent. And I'm sure a lot of this data, if it's not available, can certainly become available. But
should it be available then? This is a really important point of principle. You know, the government has promised maximum transparency. People are asking for these numbers so that they can themselves think about the risks that are involved. They can perhaps themselves imagine what kind of experience the country may go through in the next few months. Should that information be publicly available?
Well, look, what I think we should indicate, if you listen to Neil Ferguson, for example, who, as you recall, was one of those individuals who was most sort of hawkish about having the lockdown in the first place, he has indicated that this is a proportionate approach. Now, if one wants to have perfect certainty and perfect clarity, that will never exist.
And we all understand that. But this, Minister, is an important point of principle. Should these numbers be available to the public so people can understand the risks that the government has taken and people can be prepared for what the country might experience in the next couple of months?
I am absolutely clear. Maximum transparency is precisely where we want to be, and I'm sure that's that's the approach that the government has taken throughout. And that
right, but Alex, can you commit to publishing? Can you commit? Can you commit though to publishing the models that the Health Secretary talked about?
If I could just finish the point. Certainly, it is the case that when we've had the advice that's come from Public Health England, when we've had the advice that's come from those advising the government, those minutes have been published, and that will continue to be published. And of course, I'm absolutely in favour of that taking place. But the only point I really wanted to make is that you will never get total, absolute 100% clarity. The real question that the Labour Party have got to answer, it seems to me, is given what we know, is it right to move to this further stage in circumstances where not doing so has a very, very significant impact on society, on hospitality?
Yeah, I know. I hear you, and you've made those important points. But it is about publishing the internal models that the Health Secretary talked about. Let's go to Labour, Steve, because Keir Starmer has said the government's plan to end almost all of those restrictions on the 19th of July is reckless. So what is Labour's alternative plan? In terms of the date, we know the 19th of July here in England. The SNP government in Scotland is looking at the 9th of August. What date would you, the Labour Party, lift most of those restrictions?
Well, Keir's not saying the restrictions should not end. What Keir's saying, oh, there goes the bell, I'm sorry.
Yep, that's all right, it's the division bell.
I'll plough on through that, I'll just talk louder if that's okay.
do.
What Keir's saying is it's better to end the restrictions in a controlled way than in a chaotic way. And what we just saw then with, poor old Alex bravely defending the indefensible there, if the government would just tell us what the data shows when they modelled the risks, we would know what the risks were. But either the government is not telling us what that data shows because they don't want us to know because they think we won't like it, so they're covering it up, or they haven't done the modelling in the first place, in which case they are being absolutely reckless by subjecting the country to a change in the restrictions with no idea of what the consequences will be later in the year in terms of overwhelming the NHS and perhaps even pushing us into a position in the autumn where we have to lock down again. Nobody wants that.
All right.
Nobody wants
but
that. So surely the best thing to do, in response to your question, is just err on the side of caution.
All right, well, let's do that. Well, let's err on the side. Let's err on the side of caution. In terms of one restriction that is going to end on July the 19th, would you then, in the circumstances, keep the rule of 6 on indoor socialising after the 19th of July to err on the side of caution?
I've not seen data that would justify that. I think what Keir talked about there, he was right, is about the mask mandate. Now, I've got my mask with me here. I carry it around all the time. If you are on public transport, then you wear your mask.
So is that the only difference?
Space like a shop,
is that the only restriction that you would keep? Mandatory mask wearing on public transport?
No, there's other things we need to be looking at as well. People are going to start going back to offices when the working at home mandate ends. What about looking at appropriate office ventilation, for instance? If you've got a group of people in an office, my constituency office down in Croydon, for instance, we're talking to the landlord about how we can ensure appropriate ventilation through the office. I'd much rather have some clear guidance so that I knew what I was doing was the right thing to do, and so that all other workers who are going to their offices know that they're going to be treated as securely as possible through all of this. And the third element that the government really hasn't fixed in a year is getting track and trace working.
All right.
Because if the number of people getting infected is going to go up, as Sajid Javid tells us, to 100,000
All
a
right,
day,
but just to be clear, there are
there
are no other restrictions that you would keep beyond the 19th of July. So you wouldn't keep the restrictions of outdoor social events, most of them being limited to under 30 people.
Well, I haven't seen data that tells me that's a good thing to do, but then the government won't publish their modelling, will they? So we're all being kept in the dark.
All right, well, then on ventilation...
I wish we would be treated like adults by the government.
And
the British public deserve to see that data so that we can know whether what the government's doing is sensible or not. They won't tell us.
One of the things that you have just mentioned is ventilation, better ventilation in buildings, particularly if the advice is going to be now that people can go back to offices. What is Labour's plan? How much would it cost? Are you suggesting that the government fits ventilators in every office building, every classroom, before people go back?
No, I haven't suggested anything of the sort.
Right, what are you suggesting then?
What we need access to, and what the government has access to but the opposition doesn't, is the scientists and the scientific advisors that can tell them what the risks are for doing A versus doing B. If the government will not publish the data that tells us that, then we're all operating in the dark. I just think that the government should treat the British people as the adults that they are and tell them what the risks are from the modelling that they've done. And if they haven't done the modelling, then they have to admit they're just being reckless and ending these restrictions with no idea of what the consequences will be later on in the summer, or whether it might end up with us all being back in lockdown by the autumn, which nobody wants to see.
But Steve, if you say we're all operating in the dark, then why aren't you opposing every single limit that is going to be removed? Because, I mean, you said there, you're not really suggesting anything on ventilation. Isn't that actually precisely the problem? Some of our viewers might say, you're not suggesting anything, really. You're saying the government's acting too recklessly, but basically you would lift all the limits in the same way. Yes, there may be differences on masks and ventilation and self-isolation payments, but basically you're backing their position but complaining about it at the same time.
Exactly.
Well, I think, Laura, we can all see, can't we, that with the number of infections there are now, the number of deaths and hospitalisations is far lower than it was in March of this year. So clearly, the link between infection and sickness, hospitalisation, and death has been reduced, but it hasn't been entirely broken. We were hearing the Prime Minister talking about, if 90% of people get vaccinated and the vaccine is 90% effective. If you have a large enough number of people getting affected, that is still enough people getting sick to overwhelm the National Health Service. And that is the kind of thing that leads to another lockdown again. That is precisely the kind of detailed modelling we need to see that the government refuses to show us, and I don't know why.
All right, well, listen, before PMQs, we talked about universal credit, the £20 increase, and the fact that it is actually going to be phased out in the autumn, despite political pressure. Tell us exactly what's happened.
Well, what's very tricky for the government, actually, on a whole range of things, is that because the pandemic meant that they pumped all sorts of emergency support, quite understandably, to all sorts of different people. One of those things that was vital to lots of families was increasing the amount of universal credit, welfare payment that people get, whether they're in work or out of work, by £20 a week. That is going to disappear in September. The Chancellor is resolute that this is going to disappear. The Work and Pensions Secretary this morning said that families who get the benefit will be receiving letters soon saying that it's going to disappear. But on the Tory benches, there are big voices like Ian Duncan-Smith, Esther McVeigh, other former welfare secretaries who are saying it should not be removed. And the government's got a real dilemma, because taking anything away from someone
always much harder.
Always is much, much harder than saying, look, this is an emergency, they're going to provide it. And I think the government has known that this was coming, but the Treasury is pretty set on digging in here, because we've seen through the pandemic they've been forced in the end to extend things. They just don't want to do it this time because it would be expensive to carry on, but it's a real dilemma and not everybody on the Tory benches is happy about it.
Well, they're not. I mean, more than 100 Conservative MPs, Alex, called for the increase to be kept. We've just heard from Laura there, underlining the fact that 6 former Work and Pension Secretaries, and they should know, shouldn't they? So is the government making a mistake?
Well, look, this is incredibly difficult, and I absolutely get that. But we've got to have a sense of what the implications of this are. So this is about £5 or £6 billion a year. To put that into some sort of context, because the figures we've been hearing recently are so massive, that means an average couple in my constituency, right, both earning, say, £29,000, say 2 teachers, they would have to find, just to raise that amount of money, about an additional £350 from their in taxes they'd have to pay each year. And the problem with that is, of course, if we don't get our finances into some sort of order, what about those people in 30 years' time who knock on the door of the state and say, listen, we really do need some support? What if our generation has to say to them, sorry, the cupboard is bare because the previous lot spent it all? You know, there is, society, people sometimes refer to as a contract between the dead, the living, and those who are yet to be born. We have to think, for the sake of future generations, to keep our finances under some sort of control. So look, there has been a massive package of support. Of course there has, and there will continue to be ongoing support, whether it's in respect of rent, discretionary housing payments, and so on. But we do have to think about trying to live within our means at some point. Last thing, we have not lived within our means as a country since 2001.
All right.
And we are going to have to think about, for the sake of fairness, doing so in due course.
Well, Steve, your view, would you make that £20 increase, weekly £20 increase, permanent?
I mean, there are problems with the universal credit system as a whole, so I don't want to keep that system permanent. So, but for the time being, I think it's wrong to withdraw that additional £20. You know, £20 a week doesn't sound that much, but if you look at it, it's £80 a month, it's £1,040 a year. To families that are living on or close to the breadline, that is the difference between being able to cope and going into debt. It's being able to pay your rent or pay and stay in your home, or being out on the streets. Now, there are consequences if we let more people fall over the edge, and not just in terms of the social cost to them as human beings and the damage to their lives, but the cost to the rest of us in supporting those families in deeper crisis. And the other point I'd make here is, it's roughly the same time that the furlough scheme comes to an end. So we're going to see an awful lot of people suddenly finding they don't have a job, forced to go on to universal credit at the very time it's cut below the level that people can afford to live on. Now, what damage is that going to do to all those people and their families? What damage will it do to local economic recoveries if we're stopping people going out and spending at precisely the moment that we all need to be pushing the economy to motor again and to revive?
I didn't hear that. No, I hear everything you say about the families that need that money, and you wouldn't want it taken away, but you don't want it to be made permanent, or you don't want to say so at this point.
Well, no, I'm make it permanent, but I don't want this system to be permanent because universal credit doesn't work for all sorts of reasons.
Right. I mean, Alex, and just before I come back to Laura, Alex, just briefly, I mean, one of the figures from the Institute for Fiscal Studies is that actually for some families, that £20 increase constitutes 20% of their income.
Yeah. Look, I absolutely recognise the importance of this. These are immensely difficult decisions, but it is important not to see in isolation in terms of the support that's provided. So as I say, there is support that has been provided in terms of council tax, the local hardship fund, support that's been provided in terms of a housing benefit, discretionary housing payment. So it's not the case that this is the only support that is going to those individuals. But the other point is if people are coming off furlough and into work, we have to make sure that they are not going to be taxed to the point where they themselves are going to be in work poverty. So these are the very difficult balances we need to strike on top of the generational fairness point that I made.
And it is the tension that's going to be...
It is. And, Alex said this is not the only kind of support. Well, it's not the only issue where there is this tension. Coming out of this, the government, for understandable reasons, has spent incredible amounts of money, borrowed incredible amounts of money to help the country get through the pandemic. There is tension between number 10 and 11 about how and when that starts to be paid back, let alone how you might raise money on top of that for things like improving care for the elderly and care for the vulnerable. And I think that this is definitely going to be a big part of the kind of political soundtrack of the autumn. Big spending review coming up, Joe, we'll be talking about before too long. And this is a very real tension inside the Tory party as well as between all of the parties at Westminster.
And you're nodding away to what Laura's saying. So you agree, Alex, that there's a massive tension between numbers 10 and 11, the Treasury and the Prime Minister?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it's difficult. Look, just one point, because if borrowing goes up, your borrowing interest rates go up by 1%, say, right? That means in terms of the amount of money that we spend on debt interest is more than the entire budget we've got for the Ministry of Justice, right, which deals with prisons, probation. So this means that there are vulnerabilities. We have to balance these things.
I'm going to have to cut you off there because we're at the end of the programme. But thank you to
budget.
both of you. Absolutely, we're all worried about those. I'll be back at 9:15 tomorrow. Bye-bye.